Let's talk now about how we release all the value that those teams and programs have been able to create over time. We have a simple mantra here, and it's one that we want to really make sure is clear. Develop on cadence, but release anytime. What do we mean by that, right? We want to make things routine that can be routine. And a good example is I just used one, inspect and adapt. Could we all agree to run inspect and adapt every 10 weeks? I think we could. Could we all agree to do our PI planning at that point? Yes. Could we all agree to get an executive briefing at that point? We could agree to all of that, okay? So we can manage the variability in development via our own cadence-based system. We call that develop on cadence. Cadence and synchronization, those are our watchwords. I mean, I stressed that quite a bit in the earlier lesson as to what cadence and synchronization is and how we apply them. But guess what? Now, we may have cases. Let me just pretend for a second that this is all we need to do here. We're going to release on that cadence. So is it possible to release on PI cadence? It is. And by the way, many do. If I'm working in a world of, largely infrequent releases, let's just say that I used to release annually, and it's up to me to determine what my new release frequency is. I could decide to do that on PI boundaries. There's no problem with that. It's my decision. It's your decision. Release whenever it makes sense. So it's not unusual at all that we see releasing on these boundaries. But that becomes conflated with the fact that you can only release on those boundaries, and that absolutely is not true. You can release absolutely any time. We may come along here and do a major release, and we may do a subsystem release, but I'll tell you, this drawing oversimplifies the reality. The reality is you can release anything you need at any time. I could release this subsystem, maybe I could do the back office. At this point, I could release it every single day. I've got a component that I could push every day. But I may have other elements of the systems, maybe the full desktop release. Maybe it's a trading system with program trading, and the traders aren't happy to revalidate all their algorithms every single day. Okay, well, I want to do that less frequency. The point of the matter is that these are completely decoupled. They're not the same thing, right? This cadence is your kind of embedded harmonic. It's a double harmonic of a fast iteration cycle. So this is a PCDA right here, and this is a PCDA right here, and that we can control. But we want to release whenever it makes sense to do so. And it's pretty important to understand that, otherwise you'll walk away with the assumption that the frequency of release is driven by your development cadence, and it absolutely is not. The frequency of release is driven by your market. The market drives that. We as developers drive that, and these aren't the same thing. So when we conflate them, we start to put ourselves in a really tough box of saying, well, we have to release then because that's a PI. No, you don't. I could release right there. My customer wants it. It's proven. Why do I know it's proven? Because I've done all my quality practices in the middle. I've got a system. I just saw that demo last week. Can we release it to the customer? Well, it's a little bit out of sequence. Well, does that matter to our customer? Well, it depends on our internal policies. If the reality is that's a really big order, you think we're going to ship it? You bet. If the reality is it's just an incremental fix and we want to wait until the next release cycle, that's okay. That's up to you. SAFe never opines on when you release. That's your business. We have no way, a framework has no way of knowing what your release cycle needs to be. Now, how do you get ready for that? For those of you, particularly in the large kind of IT world, how do you know that you could really realistically release at any time? Well, the answer is you have to prepare for that. And we also have to recognize that simply building value, if this is the deployment operations side of the world and this is the development side of the world, creating more WIP over here doesn't do anything. No user has yet achieved the benefit of any of that content, right? They can only operate here. How do we get ready for that? How do we build a deployment pipeline that says there's always stuff moving through? I'll just throw a staging area in here. There's always stuff moving to staging. That staging environment is very much like our operating environment. So we don't have big impedance mismatches between the APIs and the configurations of this environment. They're largely the same. So this deployment pipeline allows us to streamline delivery. Our staging environment wants to emulate production, and I've indicated that here. Not that you can tell from my little chicken scratches what's indicated. This is a staging environment. It looks very much like our production environment, okay? It has the same basic configurations, the same servers. The staging environment has a router, it has a firewall, it has all the things that help us manage the security to our customer. Do I have necessarily routers and firewalls deployed over here? Not necessarily, it's not really the problem, but the staging environment has that so that it emulates production. The development and test environments also want to emulate production as much as they can. So if I go back to this development environment and say, well, it's true the staging environment is closer, there's routers and firewalls, and maybe I don't need that, but can I at least run on the same version of the application? If we're running IIS over here, can we update to the same version of IIS over here? Or maybe, gosh, we're using a later version of IIS. That's going to be trouble. That's not yet in production. So we have to communicate with that team that we need to prepare for that. Okay, so we want to make sure that wherever possible, we match production to the extent possible. And sometimes it's a responsive production to match us because we have new capabilities that are only available on the new versions of these applications that are as yet undeployed. Working software deployed to staging every iteration. So my overloaded chicken scratch is up here. We want to go here every single iteration, right? Continue to put weight on the software, run from staging, run from staging, run from staging, ready, set, almost ready to deploy. How do you do that? How do you do that in a way that makes it meaningful? A couple ways. First of all, everything under version control, okay? You know, all those, the run book and all those procedures and scripts that we use to build our environments and to test our systems. Let's just take a test case. If that test case isn't under version control, then when I push back up here from development to staging to deployment, okay, then I'm going to be running a test script that is not compatible with the current version. So I need to version everything. And we don't want to be running these long run books of manual procedures that we're so familiar with on kind of the deployment side of the world to build servers, et cetera. We got to build those automatically because that's the process by which we can deploy much more quickly. And when we have that in place, we can start to automate the actual deployment process. So instead of everybody, moving near the production center and renting the hotel for the weekend, we can start to think about, wow, we can push a button and move from staging to production. Now that's a long story. The whole DevOps movement is there to help you with that. Books like the Phoenix Project are incredibly helpful. This is a simple summation. It's as much as we can kind of describe in this course, but moving stuff from production to operations is part of lean. Let's talk about the value stream. Is the value stream all the steps we use to create good code? No, the value stream is the steps it takes to develop, validate, and deploy the code so that our user over here actually gets the latest and greatest stuff. So that's the value stream here. We can't take DevOps and isolate them and say, oh, that's a whole separate function. It might be a separate department, but they're part of our value stream as the customer. So we need to look at that. That's taking a systems view throughout the value stream. Now, when we're ready to release, there's some additional work that's involved. It's not as simple as just saying, okay, we've deployed. And let me provide an example of some of the things that you may want to postpone, if you will, until the release process. Some elements of system validation. For example, user acceptance testing is not me testing the system and say the users are going to like it. User acceptance testing includes the users. Well, can I do that every day, every iteration? Not clear. If you can, please do. But for many of us, this is a process that's semi-formal. And now that we have our innovation and planning sprint opportunity, we can use that time for user acceptance testing. Maybe some final NFRs. Maybe I need to fire up a load runner, a specialty tools, and really put a heavy load on the system. Or bring in the production database for the first time and run it against the full production database. Maybe I can't do that every day or every week. Maybe I can only do that infrequently. We're talking about economic trade-offs here. Of course, I'd love to do all my NFR testing every single day. That may not be practical. It may not be economically feasible. So it's okay to defer a few of those things. Now, if you defer them and you discover very quickly that we always found problems, well, then we better take advantage of that learning and move that NFR testing back, or at least the one that created the problems, back further into the system, back upstream. We'll use inspect and adapt to do that, to move that solution further the other way. Integration testing with other systems are not always available. I mean, I've had it explained to me very clearly, for example, how a company that builds avionics is a very expensive process to get into the customer's laboratory that actually validates the system. I mean, we're talking about millions of dollars in expenses. Well, I can preach to them all day long about the fact, well, it shouldn't be that expensive and it shouldn't be that way. It is that way. So there are cases where it simply isn't economically or technologically feasible to test with every other system, including what we'll describe shortly, the context that the system operates in. So if this is my system, excuse my ugly drawing here, and this is the system context that surrounds it, I can't always get to the system context. I am not an airplane. I'm a set of avionics, okay? This isn't an airplane either, but at least this is an airplane emulation. I can't afford to reproduce or create all of that. Now I can simulate and emulate the pieces, and as I learn what goes wrong, I can get feedback from that. But it's logical and probable and economical that not all of that can necessarily be done every single day or every single iteration. But I can do it when I need to release. I can do it at PI boundaries. I can do it at any time I need to release. What about regulatory standards and other requirements? What about, let's just say updating and finalizing traceability? I'm about to ship, let's just say a software release for a new version of an infusion pump. Have I got all my checks? Have I got all my checks? Do I have my traceability documents updated? Do I have the sign-offs I need? Have I met all the regulatory requirements? Has quality assurance or regulatory affairs, have they reviewed my work? Well, if not, I'm not going to be able to ship. So you might say, well, gosh, can't all of that be allocated back to the teams? Well, the answer is no. If you have a regulatory affairs department operating within their current quality management system, they're going to have a say, and we're going to need to address that. Well, we can't necessarily address it every day, every hour, or even every PI necessarily, but we can address it at the time at which, if these are my PI boundaries, we can address it at the time at which we want to make a release. So if this is my release box, I don't have to worry about that work if I'm not releasing. So I'm not going to necessarily check in with regulatory on all of this stuff, but at this point, I want to release that, and that's the time to address that particular problem. Other things as well, maybe release communications. I mean, we release stuff. We release the framework, we release courseware, we release products like this one, this video course that you're seeing, and we need to talk about it. Well, let's just take the time to say, what is in the release? What's the delta over this versus last one? This is the current release. Here's our prior release. Please tell me what's different. Well, do I want to maintain that documentation every day? Well, not necessarily. The reality is it's far more efficient to batch that. We talked about small batch sizes. We didn't say a batch size of 1. So we can batch up certain types of things and package them here, including release communications. What's new? What about my release notes? What's been fixed? End user documentation, we certainly try to keep up as well as we can. Maybe there's some final localization that needs to happen. I think our skills are dramatically improving here as an industry. I now know situations where literally localization happens every day. If a new string is checked into the system, a message is fired off, and a localization expert in the language that's affected, multiple of them that do that translation. But that's not everybody's case. So if it's more efficient for us for the moment to worry about the finalization of end user documentation at this point, that's fine. Can I move it back into the system? Well, I hope I can move it as far as I can. But again, we're taking an economic view, so we want to do what makes sense economically for that. Deferring it all to the end doesn't make sense economically. I'll tell you that, because when we go to write up all those manuals, number one, it introduces the delay. Here's my code. Okay, here are my manuals. They're not yet available. My code is ready to ship. I'm sorry, you can't ship because we won't have the documentation. What did that just do? That just cranked up my cost of delivery. So I want to get it as close as I can, but it's not identically equal to it is ever present and ever ready. Close as we can make it economically, but not necessarily ever present. Finalize the bill of materials. There's some stuff we're going to do. What about the deployment scripts, and what about the surrounding documentations, and what about the applets and the widgets that I want to ship along with my system? Training support personnel. We go through that process as well. We have to teach people how to use our stuff and deploy our stuff. Can I afford to teach them every day? Of course not. It's a good example of why a batch size of 1 isn't necessarily perfect. Look at batching up these things and doing them very efficiently when we know what we're shipping is just good economic sense. It's just practical. We don't have to, kill ourselves over the fact that there were some things that waited to the end. They waited to the end on purpose. They waited to the end because it's economically viable to do it then, not because we're silly and we don't really understand the nature of agile development. Installation, deployment instructions, I think I've kind of belabored these items. It's your list is your list. Your definition of done needs to include these things, potentially including, as I mentioned, the legal and regulatory or other approvals. Speaking of definition of done, here's a safe definition of done, and I certainly won't parse this and test your eyes in the process, but what we've described is the ability or the mandate for teams to build high quality increments. And here's some examples of definition of done elements for high quality increments. However, the system is the thing, right? It's when the system comes together that it really gets interesting. The system increment has its own definition of done. The solution, if we look at the value stream level, larger systems as well have capabilities and NFRs met and similar definitions of done. And then the release object itself, that tends to have these other things, right? We've done the final regression testing, we've maybe done the user acceptance testing, release documentation is complete. So Agile teams are really familiar with definition of done. It's how they basically establish quality policy. I guess in a way it is their quality management system. So they have a DoD, and that reflects their quality systems, and they use that, and that's their policy to support that definition of done. So we know that we're building quality throughout the system, and iteration by iteration, team by team, feature by feature, and the addition of validation activities create a releasable solution. So that's it for this lesson, and I can briefly summarize what I hope I've helped you learn. One is that we learned the basic constructs involved in executing an iteration, not trivial things, but iterating is the heart of Agile development. If we don't do that well, you can kind of forget the rest of SAFe because nothing's going to scale well if you can't iterate. We learned how to build robust systems using enablers, this funny word of enablers, these technological initiatives that help build architectural runway. We were introduced to the various ceremonies and activities that are important for effective PI execution. They're flexible in many ways. Some, like the system demo, that's not so flexible. Obviously, PI planning and PI demo, we have to do that. Others, Scrum and Scrums, Art Sync, release management, very much dependent on your local context. And we also learned how to improve program performance with Inspect and Adapt. We learned how to close the loop. It's not simply a matter of planning. It's a matter of planning the work, doing the work, checking the work, and adjusting the work so that you truly close the loop on this system. If you do these things well, you'll deliver value at a rate that might surprise you. We've also learned how to release value on demand. We've provided a definition of done that can help you manage the development of your system in a continuous, high-quality manner. So let's move on to Lesson 7.